Thanks, Bilal. We have a virtual panel. All our attendees are virtual, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of introduction right now, and then I'm going to sit down and listen to the voices of God from the ceiling as we talk certain things through. I was introduced before. What you didn't hear about is the day job that supports me so I can do all this ASCE work. I'm the infrastructure director for GHD, which is a $2 billion multinational company. We have 4,000 people in the U.S. Much of our work is done on the private side, and so, we can't talk about what we do, so we're not as well known as some of the others. We're 27 on the NR list. Some of the things I was going to talk about had to do with the report card. I'm going to cut that short because we had a lot of that conversation already this morning in our questions. But what I do want to tell you about is that GHD is coming up to our own centennial. And we have a strategic plan, and we have focused on 3 separate areas. One being the future of water, one being the future of energy, and one being future communities. The future of water, basically we came up with a report called Aquanomics. And it talks about not only the fact that we're going to have issues because we either have not enough or too much, depending on where you are, and potability and the amount of people that don't have access to good water. Our future energy program was called Shocked, and it is about the energy transition and the amount of energy we are going to need to run a modern economy. I have to tell you, we were at a Reuters event when we were presenting that in New York 2 years ago, if you remember the Canadian wildfires. We were at the Marriott, which has a 20-story atrium in Times Square, and the smoke alarms were going off. The air was orange in Manhattan. It looked like a B-rate science fiction movie from all the particulate matter that was in Manhattan at that point. We were wearing masks inside because of how bad it was. And then future communities, which last year we put out a report called Crossroads. And what we do to support this is we talk to clients and stakeholders around the world. We put a pretty extensive survey out. And what is relevant to what we're talking about here with resilience is in the U.S. we had more than 4,000 responses, and a full 50% of the individuals that responded have personally been impacted by climate change and non-resilient infrastructure. Their home, their business, a place that they do business at, not one-off, they themselves. And the remainder, all of them were one person separated from somebody who lost a home, who, whatever. So constituents get it. There's a broken link there between the constituents and some of the elected officials. But individuals are being impacted, and they get it. We talked about the report card. We issued it. We do it every 4 years. It was issued at the end of March. To celebrate the fact we're at a C- is just beyond my comprehension. But it's also the first time we've never had a D- in any of our scores. So the fact that Tom talked about 9 out of 18 being Ds, there was no D-. Yay! My line on that is we have 3 sons, and they wouldn't have been to adulthood if for 3 decades they would have brought Ds home, but that's another story. And so we saw all this investment with IIJA, $550 billion more than what we had before. And we're seeing with the conversations we're having on the Hill that the reauthorization of transportation, they are going to be looking at the baseline being at or more than what we have now, which is good news. There's some thought that water and wastewater might also go in that, but not everything else that was in IIJA. They don't want to talk about everything else. The transitions, I can tell you watching very closely, one of the things I do is watch Washington for my company on how we have to pivot, especially with private clients. How do we pivot? And the Senate parliamentarian has jettisoned a lot of stuff that was going to be policy issues that we were going to have to address that had to do with unfunding certain areas, lowering the funding of certain areas. They're not allowing that. So we'll see how all that plays out in the next few days. But I do know when we talk about environmental and bad actor threats, you got to watch the language. As I said, I'm a non-female now, or a non-male. I'm not a female. Can't be that in this environment. But I think we have to look at because what we're doing is the right thing, but language matters. There's things that we say, and if we frame it in a certain way, it'll be dead on arrival whether it's good stuff or not. So I think that's really important. We have to talk about, the report card talks about resiliency. And I can tell you, we met with CEQ, and I was here. I'm thrilled to be back. I was here when we signed that MOU with Richard Spinrad. We got to bring him back. I know he's back to Oregon, but we got to get him more involved again. And I think we really are on the right path. But resilience means different things to different people. And I had mentioned this morning that the financing has to be resilient as well. And if we don't have infrastructure that's resilient, then the financing isn't going to be resilient. And so that's something we really want to focus on. When you will hear some of the panels, and you know, I've been doing rounds with resilience here for a while, the return on investment, depending on the asset class, where it is and what the hazards are, anywhere between 1 to 5 to 1 to 96. I mean, if you're talking to business people, they get that. We have to talk about the business case. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about how the report card, what we're seeing. The one thing I can tell you, the week after we issued the report card, the Committee on America's Infrastructure got a report on the media, and we had almost 200 separate articles, newscasts, blogs, various podcasts, radio. It was almost 200. The individual hits of people who heard, saw, or read in 1 week was 2.6 billion. And one of the things I heard, well, that's AI. It's fine that it's AI. Somebody's finding it. Somebody's hearing it. And we were talking about resilience. So it's really important we move forward. So joining me on this panel is Christina Swallow, who's the Assistant City Manager of Tucson. We're going to get her on a camera here. We've got Darren Olson, who's Chair of ASCE's Committee on America's Infrastructure, and he's Vice President and Water Resources Department Head at Christopher Burke Engineering. And Natalie Anclade, the Executive Director of Build Strong America. So I am going to move here. They're going to be speaking from online, and I hope the mic is working for you. Okay. Can you hear me online?
Now we can.
Okay, great. So I have a number of questions for everybody, and then I have a number of individual questions based on your expertise. First of all, from your experience and what we went through, we've been doing this since 1998, and you know, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and I think the same with climate data and all the issues we're dealing with resilience. From your experiences, what policies or innovations have you seen that are driving smarter and more resilient infrastructure that excites you? And let's start off with Christina.
Good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here. I'm actually going to talk about this in terms of my former experience as a DOT leader. I was the director of the Nevada Department of Transportation, and a couple of the things that I really liked that the DOTs were doing is really investing in research. So this is to innovations, investing in research to develop pavement technologies that would help be more resilient to the extreme temperatures. That is something at the time I was in Nevada. I was up in Carson City, and Nevada has very diverse geography. We have very cold winters up in the mountains and the Sierras, and we have very hot summers, as you know, in Vegas. And so figuring out pavement technologies that would weather the normal, but then also the increasingly frequent extreme temperatures that we're starting to see, whether it's extremely hot, never envisioned before, or extremely cold, looking at those pavement technologies. So we wouldn't have failing pavements just because we were having extreme weather. So that is one DOT example. And the other that was particularly important in Nevada, but is important overall, is really looking at risk and vulnerability and identifying and prioritizing asset preservation, I guess would be the best term, to make sure that you're focusing on those pieces that are the most critical and most vulnerable. And the way that manifested in Nevada was, some of our corridors, I-80, for instance, if we had a piece of I-80 go out, the detour might be 400 miles long. So we were starting to talk about, well, how do we make sure that we maintain I-80 and all of the associated components of that infrastructure to ensure that we don't have to have a 4-hour detour, and starting to look forward and think through those things. So it was actually more in the DOT space. I'm super excited, but we're going to talk about Tucson here in a bit. But I wanted to lean in a little bit on where policies, that's the vulnerability, the risk, the asset management that the DOTs are doing, and also innovation, really looking at the materials and the technologies that we're using to make sure that they are going to help us as we move further into this space where with the climate unknowns.
Thanks, Christina. I should note that AASHTO, as well as the National Governors Association, has testified in front of Congress, as well as put out documents about keeping that infrastructure level finance up at a high level. So, they're paying attention, hopefully. Darren?
Yes. So I, as a water resources engineer, Maria, you're correct, I was also the chair of CAI, but in my day job, I'm a water resources engineer, and what excites me is rainfall, right? Any good water resources engineer gets excited about rainfall, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience there also get excited about rainfall. And with NOAA Atlas 15 coming out, that's something certainly when we talk about new technology and innovation. That's fantastic. Here in Illinois, I'm from the Chicagoland area. We have our issue with precipitation is we get too much of it, right? Unlike Christina, who probably doesn't get enough of it, we get too much of it. And in fact, what we've seen over probably the past several decades is the number of storms that we're getting that are 2 inches or greater here in the Midwest. It has doubled. And so independent of what NOAA is doing with Atlas 15, here in Illinois, the Illinois State Water Survey has taken it upon themselves to update our rainfall design storms. And so they, way back when, probably in the 1990s, they had what was called Bulletin 70, which kind of laid the framework for every storm sewer, every detention basin, every development, every roadway culvert has designed what was designed based on Bulletin 70. And then as we start to see this trend with the climate changing, getting these more severe storms, there was pressure on the State Water Survey to update those rainfall standards. And so they did that in 2019. They used another 25 years of more recent data and updated the rainfall in a publication called Bulletin 75. I don't know how they come up with the numbering, but Bulletin 75 was the new rainfall data, and it essentially took our 100-year event and added about an inch of rain to it, which at first you would think there would be this outcry maybe from the development community and even people that are using this, that everything's going to have to get bigger, right? My culverts are going to have to get bigger, my detention basins are going to have to get bigger. But what we saw was that people really embraced this. People were like, yeah, of course, it's totally raining more now than it was 30 years ago, and the rains are getting more intense and more frequent. And so there was this adoption of that new rainfall standard almost instantaneously. So I think it came out in 2019 here in the state, and by 2020, every state agency, every local municipality, every county, they all had adopted this new rainfall standard. And so we kind of thought that was the end story, right? And so there was this policy that they were going to update it every 15 years. And it was great. We're all using now was more current rainfall data that had some future projections in it. But lo and behold, just a few years later now, the Illinois State Water Survey has come out with something called Bulletin 76. And it is looking at what those rainfall design standards would be potentially in 2050, 2075, and in 2100. So for the next like 20 and 25-year increment, how is this rainfall going to change? And again, you would think people are like, oh my gosh, this is, too much. Everything's going to have to get bigger. There is like a race to try to adopt this now. And so I think when I look back and you talk about innovation and what trends we're seeing, it's refreshing to see that there is an acknowledgement from at least a rainfall perspective here in Illinois. And I think if you asked anyone throughout the Midwest, they would say the same thing, is that it's changing. We certainly have an infrastructure that needs to adapt to what Mother Nature's throwing at it, and there's an appetite to do that. So I guess that's right now it's 98 degrees here in Chicago, and rainfall is what I'm thinking about, just to get the grass to green up. But from a resilience perspective, it is refreshing to see that people are acknowledging that we need to update these, and that's my segment on that.
Thanks, Darren. And again, there's adoption because the constituents get it. They're impacted. They get it. Natalie, from your perspective, what's going on that's smarter and more resilient, that's exciting you these days?
So to table set for a second. So Build Strong's a nonprofit organization, and we advocate for increasing investments in mitigation to draw down disaster costs and losses. So whatever that means. So more money for mitigation, stronger, safer building codes, more lifeline resilient infrastructure, so on and so forth. So what excites me and Build Strong generally is when that policy and innovation actually change behavior. So it's not just funding more projects, but how do we get people, communities, everybody to kind of buy into let's build things stronger, pun intended. So at Build Strong, we've really seen these incentives work. We can just look at Texas, for example. When you're thinking about Texas, you're not really like, Texas is really good at climate activism. But they are the national leader in renewable energy. And that's because policies and regulations were structured at the federal level to reward innovation and investment in renewable energy. And so that same principle applies to resilience. When those right incentives are in place, the communities really step up, states step up. And just kind of as a side note, somebody mentioned earlier that words do matter. When you mention building codes, kind of people are like, gross. But we have noticed that when you say standards, everybody wants to build to the right standards. So we have been saying, let's build to stronger standards if you can't get them to buy into building code. But because of these incentives, changing that behavior, we've been really strong proponents of, like FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, the BRIC program. And I can say I was a former Hill staffer when BRIC was being written into law for Senate Homeland Security Governmental Affairs Committee. And I can say that, and I say this with full love, that Build Strong was probably the most annoying lobby that I've ever met in my life. And now I'm here, so I get to be annoying. But while BRIC has strayed from that original purpose, the core idea does remain solid. So the direct federal resources towards that hard infrastructure before disaster strike, embed resilience into design and construction standards, and then reward those communities that are making the smart long-term investments to reduce risk. It's not just about spending more. It's about building better, stronger with that future in mind. And I also get really excited about seeing states that are starting to prioritize projects based on risk and data. Federal programs don't exactly reward that, but states are starting to do it themselves. So they are using resilience scorecards, mapping tools, and other technology like AI to ensure dollars are going where they need to go to do the most good. But again, like that social behavior, the real breakthroughs that we're seeing aren't always technical. They're cultural. And so we like to see, and I get really excited to see when the governors, the mayors, the state legislatures really treat resilience as a governing principle and not just the buzzword of the day, because that's when we're really going to see these transformative investments.
That's great, thank you. And I have to tell you, whether BRIC's funded or not, and we'll see how all that works through the courts and a lot of other things that are going on. The thing that was important to me to BRIC was not necessarily, and that was done under President Trump when he was Trump 45, was the fact for the first time across asset classes and across communities that we said, thou shalt follow these standards. It wasn't about codes, it was about a whole list of standards that was actually in that legislation of what we should follow. So it was the beginning of us really ingraining standards into how we do things at a federal level. Darren, I'm going to switch over to you. A critical reason for the great improvement was the IIJA increase in investment. What are you thinking about the continual federal investment moving forward, and what happens economically if we don't continue at the levels we're at right now?
Thanks, Maria. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the report that we did last year, not the report card, but the year before that, called Bridging the Gap. And I think it's interesting when you think about the title of that report that looked at what is the infrastructure gap that we're facing. The report before that in 2021 was called Failure to Act, right? And so that report, just the title alone of that report really signified, at that time in 2021 that we were not acting to fill our infrastructure gap. And but we have, and we know that, and we've talked about that previously here today with IIJA and IRA. And so this new report that we came out with last year was called Bridging the Gap. And it talked about, what are the economics behind it, and what are the economic really benefits when we start to invest in our infrastructure. And we can boil it down in a couple different ways. One of the ones that when we talk with our elected officials, they're representing the people of the United States. We talk about, how much is this saving families when we invest in our infrastructure? And back in 2021, we talked about poor infrastructure was costing the average household $3,300 a year. So that is, new groceries you have to buy when the electricity goes out. That's buying bottled water. That's time wasted when, maybe a bridge washes out because it was under-designed. And so that's what the cost was at the time to the average American family. In this new report, we looked at it two different ways. What would happen if we continued to act? That is, continuing with these investment levels under IIJA. And it was refreshing, Maria, to hear you talk about, potentially there is, an appetite to continue to do that. And then what would happen if we snap back? Meaning that we had that one-time investment of IIJA, and then we essentially snap back to the old funding levels. And what's interesting to note, simply, with the IIJA and the IRA, we did see a decrease in the cost to families, right? So families went from paying $3,300 a year for poor infrastructure down to closer to $2,700 a year simply by that one-time investment. But the key is, and this is really the key, if we continue to invest, like the way that we are now, we're going to save the American family another $700 a year. Right, and that's pretty powerful when you go to talk to elected officials, how much their constituents are going to be saving simply if we continue to invest the way we are. And then we looked at it, and you could look at the gap itself, the roughly $3.7 trillion gap over 10 years. The IIJA, that this one-time hit, it really slowed the growth of that gap. But when you look at what is it going to take, and this is a question that we get all the time, it's like $3.7 trillion. How do you even start to chip away at that? Because really, I guess even a question before that is, how did we get here in the first place, right? I mean, how do we end up with $3.7 trillion in gap over 10 years? And it's really because we've been underinvesting for decades, right? We didn't get ourselves here over the span of a few years or even a decade. We got ourselves here for decades and decades of underinvestment in our infrastructure. So it's going to take us a while to get that gap back down to a reasonable level. IIJA and IRA slowed the growth of that, but what we saw is that if we continue to invest this way, we will actually start to see the curve bend a little bit, right? So we've slowed the growth of it, but to actually start to bring that gap back down and reducing it, we're going to have to continue to invest the way that we are now, and that's really a good start. When you look at what else is impacted by, if we don't continue to invest, the example I like to use a lot is manufacturing. Manufacturing of all the industries. I mean, industries, will save roughly $1.2 trillion if we continue to invest the way we are now over the next 10 years. But manufacturing is the one that's probably would be hit the hardest if we didn't, right? It's, I think it's like $280 billion up through 2023 that we would save if we continue to invest the way that we are now. And so, and of course, we can think about manufacturing. You need electricity, you need water, you need, to bring goods to market, you need transportation, all these things. And if we can build those more resiliently so that they're not impacted by the next, either natural man-made disaster, we're going to really see a benefit to our economy. Hopefully that addressed the question, Maria.
Awesome. Thank you, Darren. And, as we're looking forward, it's important that we look at that we have all hands on deck. I'm gonna keep beating this drum. We're gonna talk about this tomorrow about new partners and partnering with the financial community. And Terry can give us some of the statistics tomorrow, but that gap could be filled easily in 10 years with more general municipal bonding and more private money at the table. They have that money right now. But we have to streamline the processes. They don't want to spend time and energy on processes that are outdated. And so it's going to be really important that we be our best selves as engineers in getting projects from the planning stage to being able to be implemented. That average for USDOT used to be 15 years from beginning an EIS to finishing construction. They've got it down to 10. I can tell you I've done it on mega projects in 5. It's not easy. It's hard. It's hard work, but you can do it, and we have to be able to prove that we can do it. Christina, over to you. You gave us a little look under the hood about Tucson. Tell us about the impacts of climate change in Tucson, which I can't even imagine. If it's 100 in Washington, what's the temperature in Tucson today? What are you feeling, and what plans and programs are you doing in Tucson for resilience in the community?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So I grew up here in Tucson, and I can attest to the fact that this is not new for Tucson at all. When I was growing up here in the 70s, we were already talking about water conservation and how water was a limited supply resource, and we really needed to work on making sure that it lasts to allow for our community to grow. In the 80s, we had devastating floods. Early 80s, I remember my parents were out of town. The whole town was flooding. We were watching on the news, houses falling into our washes. So we have had the impacts of climate change now for time, as all communities have, but Tucson recognized the need to evolve the way we plan and manage our resources early on, and we're continuing to do so. I should note that it's sort of interesting that the last 2 cities that I spent the most time in before I moved back to Tucson are also 2 of the fastest warming cities. So it's sort of an interesting space to have lived in Las Vegas and in Reno, Nevada, which are on the top 10 list of fastest warming in the nation. And then also Tucson, so the desert, we're not on, I don't even think we're in the top 10. So trying to figure out, well, what are we doing differently and what are we thinking about? And I think it's the fact that we've been thinking about this for a really long time. But in 2023, we issued our Tucson Resilient Together plan, and was really focused, a large part of it is focused on carbon neutrality, but it's an adaptation and mitigation plan that touches everything that we do. It talks about our, replacing our fleets and equipment. So, how are we fueling the equipment that our transportation teams use when they do storm damage cleanup? What are our parks departments using to, when they do, what is the fuel of that? Like, it's very granular, but it's literally from the fleets all the way down to the equipment. We looked at are looking and thinking through and changing how we plan our streets and our land use, how we move and how we live in the space, and really looking to make sure that we're not just continuing to grow into available land, but we're also using the land that we have available smartly and wisely, and mitigating our impact on the environment overall. We have a Million Trees program. We have a Storm to Shade program. And years ago, we actually created a commercial rainwater harvesting program so that every new commercial development actually has to collect the water. I mean, and this may not seem so evolutionary, but here it definitely is. Collect the water on site and use it to grow vegetation, right? Because that's important that we have that shade and that cooling that we get from the vegetation. It includes procurement. It includes clean energy policy goals that not just are we doing, but we're also doing it with our energy partners, low impact development. But beyond that, it also looks at the fact that we are hot and getting hotter. So while we've been thinking through water and continue to really evolve our water, we're actually getting ready to build our first direct potable reuse plant here in the next several years. Like, it's an active conversation. It's I don't know if it's fully funded yet, but we are working on developing that because we know water is critical. We actually use less water per capita today than we did then, but also I think it's less overall consumption, even though we've grown significantly since the 90s because we've conserved our water resources so well. But we're looking at and using data to address our most vulnerable communities, because unfortunately what we have found is a lot of times our lower socioeconomic communities are also the ones that are most vulnerable to heat, most vulnerable to flooding. And so we're using data to focus on where do we locate our cooling centers, because unfortunately it is hot. And so now we have cooling centers. That's not something that we were doing even 5 years ago. It's something we're doing today. And we're thinking through, what does that mean to be a cooling center? And how do we make it better? So we're thinking through climate resilience hubs and figuring out how to put battery electric storage systems at those resilient centers so that they don't just serve in the summer when our grid is up, but they help serve when the grid goes down. Because as we know from our report card, the grid is not 100% reliable. And so it does go down in the summers, especially in our harder communities. And so how do we make sure our cooling centers stay cool during those timeframes? And also, can that battery storage system help us in other elements throughout the year? Thinking through the gray versus green infrastructure. When we had those floods in '83, and there's been lots of flooding events since then, we're a desert community. So when it rains, it pours, legitimately, like it pours. And it floods because there's just no way that our hard desert earth can really absorb it all that fast. And so what's interesting is, and it's a difference in strategy. I'm gonna say it's a difference in strategy. I don't know that one is better than the other. Vegas has a lot of very gray infrastructure. They have large regional detention basins. That's where they collect the water and help mitigate the flooding. Here, we really leaned in on the green infrastructure, and we have environmental resource zones where we focus on the riparian areas and making sure we protect those for flora and fauna so that our community also can benefit from these investments, and as well as being protected from flood events. So it's just different strategies, but it's something that Tucson has been thinking thoughtfully about for decades. And I'm really proud to be a part of some of this work. And to Natalie's point on building codes, Tucson was one of the leading cities on a RECCE grant to develop a Southwest model building code to really look at resilience to extreme heat throughout the Southwest. What does that look like? Is there a requirement for wall insulation? And how do we make sure that our new, and unfortunately it is the new building stock, but the new building stock is more resilient? And then what do we think about and how do we train our workforces to look at the existing building stock? So when we do go in and have to do a remodel or do some adjustment to an existing building stock, how do we make sure that it's more resilient moving forward? So Tucson is doing a lot, but also has been. I don't think that's a real change in our character. It's something that we've been doing. Our community expects it of us. Our leadership leans in. In fact, the Tucson Million Trees was an initiative of the mayor's. And I would say within that space, we actually now have a facility where we're growing our own trees to make sure that we have the supply of trees that we need for our own projects and for other projects. We're looking at resource recovery through our waste management system and our landfill. We're really trying to make sure that we're not landfilling anything that doesn't need to be landfilled. So, I mean, this program and plan is comprehensive. It's a long-term strategy, but we're making progress on it, tracking it every quarter with our mayor and council and reporting on where we've made progress and really looking to figure out how we can do things better, more efficiently, more effectively, and preserve the community that people really love so much. I will note that there have been some challenges recently. So with some of the federal funding, and that we had programs and plans and strategies and grants that we were going to deliver, that those have changed. And so we're now being forced to kind of look at how do we continue to deliver those programs when the funding model maybe has changed. And I would also say, and to Natalie's point a little bit, you know, that there is challenges with people want to do the right thing, but then in the environment that we're in, when housing affordability is so critical, there is some push-pull between housing affordability today versus longevity and resilience tomorrow. In fact, we just adopted the 2021. We're on a 3-year cycle or a 6-year cycle. We adopt every 6 years the new building codes, but we didn't adopt the energy code yet, in part because it's not been fully released. It's been released, but doesn't have all the additional tools with it. But also because our community was really pushing back at the cost impact to some of the housing stock. And so we're looking through and trying to figure out how do we adopt and move forward and really lean into the space so that we do have resilient, energy efficient building stock, but do it in a way that matters. And in fact, yesterday I was having a conversation with a stakeholder, and he said, well, a lot of our residential, our single family residential, are not commercial, so not the multifamily, but the single family, a lot of it, they're already there, but they may not be there in a prescriptive way. So he's like, so how do we look at our codes and our standards to achieve the outcome, but maybe not in the most granular prescriptive way to do it? So we're having really robust conversations about how do we meet the needs of today and tomorrow, recognizing that they're changing and we're going to have to change with them.
Thanks, Christina. And it's good to hear that there's political will to do this. I mean, obviously, we need to celebrate the areas of the country that have the political will to do this. Natalie, totally shifting gears here, making the case for increased investments in resilient infrastructure, we need other sectors. So we can elevate the conversations with elected officials at the local, state, and federal level. Build Strong has been able to build a diverse coalition, including insurance companies and commercial real estate developers, and bring them into the discussion. How are these other sectors seeing the issue, and what are their top priorities?
Yeah, so Build Strong was actually started by the insurance industry, with them understanding that resilience and building stronger is about much more than just insurance interests. This includes engineers, emergency managers, first responders, the fire service. My favorite talking point about the fire service is they are the end users of building codes and standards, code specialists, and just anybody else interested in resilience, which is we are very much a big tent organization. And there are a lot of interests related to resilience across the country. So because of that, we have worked really hard to build this diverse coalition that includes people that you might not expect. The real estate industry, the home builders, I know Gary was there or may be on virtually. Home builders and real estate developers get beat up a lot about not wanting to be, about wanting to build cheaper all the time. But a lot have joined into our coalition, like commercial real estate developers, lenders, as well as resilient infrastructure manufacturers to join our insurance companies who originally started Build Strong. So kind of their focus, their perspectives, insurance companies focus on obviously reducing risk, making sure that what they're underwriting accurately reflects true exposures. We don't really have an insurance crisis across the nation. We have a risk management crisis across the nation. We want policies and the insurance industry wants policies and regulations that encourage those stronger building codes or standards, depending if you can't stomach the word building code. We love standards. And they also want better data that's more forward-looking. It's great to price things based on past hazards, but things are changing daily. And so look that forward-looking data so that we can price properly and support mitigation efforts. Developers and real estate agents, they really see resilience as tied to their credibility and reputation. Building and marketing resilient properties help them stand out in a competitive market and really builds that trust with their buyers. For lenders, it's about protecting their investments. Obviously, they don't want to be stuck with a destroyed property that is far less than the loan that they issued. One of the things that we're working on with lenders in the financial markets right now is there a way for you to give a percentage or sorry, I'm a resilience nerd, not a banking nerd, but is there a way to give a percentage decrease on a HELOC if you were going to use that money to build your home more resiliently? So things like that. Resilient infrastructure manufacturers, they're super critical too. I mean, it's one of the things that we worked on with the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. Previously, if you rebuilt post-disaster, if it was an electric pole, it was a wooden pole, you had to put it up with a wooden pole. You could not put it up with a stronger wooden pole. After Dura, you were mandated to put it up with a stronger material, stronger pole, build back stronger, build it up to the latest edition of codes. So the resilient manufacturers, they're critical in this too. They want more innovation, and supply stronger materials and technologies that obviously that create safer buildings and systems. Their interest lies in expanding the market for resilient products and bringing those innovations to bring anything that reduces disaster risk. And then you have manufacturers and utilities that are focused on keeping operations running smoothly across all lifeline infrastructure to minimize that disruption from extreme weather and other hazards. We hear it all the time that critical infrastructure failure is a climate risk multiplier. Time and time again, we're seeing after every massive storm, specifically hurricanes, and the blizzards, the nor'easters, that the longer power is out, the more deaths are attributed to extreme heat, extreme cold. So from an emergency manager's perspective or first responders perspective, getting those lifeline systems up and running faster or better yet, having them not go out at all is really crucial. And so bringing all of these perspectives together helps everyone see that resilient infrastructure isn't just about regulations or spending. It's really that smart investment that pays off for the communities, as well as the small businesses and businesses in the communities, which really helps the economy. That we have found that this broader conversation, especially with all of these groups coming together, is kind of what we need to build this momentum for change. It really worked in 2017 to sell the case for mitigation. We have found, like on the Hill, if the emergency managers aren't able to sell the cost benefit there, then we can bring in another stakeholder who's able to sell that benefit to their representative or their senator. And unfortunately, we're back in that 2017 situation where we're selling the case for mitigation again. And so that's what we're doing it all over again. So I think that it's not just about one group everybody has an interest in resilience. It's just finding that niche for each group.
Thanks, Natalie. We are almost at time. I want to give you all an opportunity. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining the panel. But I'd like to give you an opportunity for like a 30-second, one sentence, what you want this group to accomplish based on your perspective. What's the one thing, if you could change, if you were master of the universe, and what should we tackle moving forward? Let's start with Darren.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure here. So, I go back to the some of the recommendations from the report card, and one of them, policy and innovation. I think we're at a unique spot right now. I mean, granted, the grade improved slightly, but we've got like this huge, gap of infrastructure funding. We're starting to see some funding come into it. If we can keep that funding, I think the key for us is going to be using technology, right? And how do we use technology to get us doing things faster, better, more resilient? And as a 51-year-old, I'm probably not the person to do this, but I sure would hope that those with those ideas can really bring those to the forefront.
Thanks, Darren. Christina.
I hate to say it, but I'm sort of on the same page as Darren. And Darren, I don't know that 51 excludes you from being on the pace with the technology, but it really is funding for smart policies and investments that really help move the needle. And I'm just thinking about some of these things. I'll use our battery electric storage system, right? That is a smart system that will help us be more resilient to a grid outage and keep our community in a space where we can be safe and resilient. Now, how we fund it, that's one of those things that there isn't a natural funding stream for. So thinking through how do we make sure that there is funding that helps us be more resilient in whatever way that is, but smart investments. I think that's the key. And ASCE has been using that as one of our talking points for years. This is not the first time that our report card has said smart investments. So yeah.
Thanks, Christina. Natalie, bring us home.
All right. I think one of the things that we are seriously lacking across the nation is our constituents, each individual person in the country advocating for stronger homes, stronger critical infrastructure. When it comes down to it, our politicians at every single level are hearing, we want more parks, we want all these other things that are great and wonderful, but our critical infrastructure is at a C, and nobody is calling about our critical infrastructure. So I think we need a huge grassroots movement. The ASCE report card is perfect and a perfect example for all of us to take it, give it to our neighbors, be the most annoying person at the HOA meeting, and just get everybody super excited to start calling their local politicians, state politicians, anybody and everybody who will listen and start advocating. Yeah, parks will be great once we get this situated. So
Natalie,
that's my call.
Thank you so much for your paid advertisement for ASCE. Let's all give our panel a round of applause. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.